Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. My name is Vineet Kaur. This webinar will begin with a 15-minute discussion with the presenters, and then it will be followed by 30 minutes for Q&A. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenters. First, we have Jasleen Kaur. Jasleen is a WVA grad in religious studies, focusing on South Asian religions through the lens of literature and poetry. She's currently working as a researcher with Sikri. She's passionate about projects that create comfortable spaces for community members of all ages and backgrounds to engage in dialogue and learn from one another. Next, we have Shuranjeet Singh. Shuranjeet is the founder and director of Taraqi, a movement working with Punjabi communities to reshape approaches to mental health. Shuranjeet is currently pursuing a master's in health policy, management, and evaluation at the University of Toronto. His interests lie in the intersections of healthcare, society, and social inequalities. He likes to explore the role of Sikhi and Sikhs, often erased in mainstream historical narratives. And lastly, we have Vineet Kaur. Vineet loves to explore how individual systems interact to form global patterns, which inspire her to adapt her understanding of cognitive sciences to explore spiritual elements of faith and wonder. Vineet engages with Sikhi through personal introspection, research, leadership programs, and community initiatives to create space for conversations around resilience and oneness. Please welcome our presenters for today. Thank you all for joining me today on this lovely Sunday morning. So today we're going to be talking about reimagining Sangat. But I think first I'd like to start by each of us going around kind of giving our initial thoughts on what our understandings of Sangat are. Perhaps we can start with Vineet.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm really excited to engage in a conversation around Sangat because it is through understanding, my Sangat that I have been exposed to the possibility of how to be vulnerable around a group of, around my Sangat. And it's through that vulnerability that I've even learned to tap into what faith is, because faith is so vulnerability based for me. So it has a very deep meaning for me, how I engage with Sangat. Throughout my life, I've grown up in a family where visiting Gurduara spaces and finding Sangat wasn't something that was exercised actively. So I think I grew up feeling that I didn't have Sangat. And when I did start to engage with Sikhi, I constantly carried that baggage with me, thinking that my Sangat is lacking in my life. Little did I know at that point that I did always have Sangat. I was the one creating boundaries around that Sangat. And invisibly limiting the potential of my friends and my family and all those who temporarily engaged with me, even in like small moments. I was the one deciding that they weren't going to be my Sangat because they weren't fitting into like the traditional mold of what I had learned. And so maybe to like now reimagine that aspect, I'm recalling this one story of how I reimagine when I was able to break that barrier of inviting myself into Sangat and inviting Sangat into my life in a more wholehearted way. And that was when I started realizing that my friends were challenging me to be the person that I didn't want to be. And so there was resistance coming in from within when I was in university and I was starting to learn about Sikhi through the Sikh student associations on campus, and then I had friends that were non-Sikhs. And the conversations that I'm having in these two groups are keeping me up at night in the same way, because they're helping me go within and realize what my vulnerabilities are, what my shortcomings are, and how I'm resistant to certain things that are out there and happening, but it's my mental blocks coming through. Um, and so I think throughout this webinar, as I talk about Sikhi, I'd like to keep this Saki in my mind, which is when Guru Nanak Sahib was on his Udasiya and traveling, and he comes across a, a group of peers. And he's traveling, he's visiting all these places, and as a symbol of letting Guru Nanak Sahib know that there's a lot of peers already here and there's no space for another holy man within the sanctity of that city, they present and they send him with a bowl of milk, letting him know that it's full to the brim and there's no space for anyone. And Guru Nanak Sahib sends that bowl back with jasmine flowers in it, symbolizing that my presence is so light and my presence is fragrance. So I don't need to occupy the heavy space of what you think light or divine or essence or fragrance is. I will bring my own flavor without changing what the composition of that milk is, but make it still make it more fragrant, give it new qualities and virtues. And I relate myself to that bowl of milk because understanding, even like beginning to understand what Sangat was, I thought of myself as that bowl of milk, and I thought that I was full in a lot of different ways and I didn't need to be challenged or I didn't need to reflect on certain things. And it is when my friends were bringing their essence and their fragrance into my life that I realized that there was something missing. There was a flavor that was missing. And I hope that in our conversation today, we explore how we can determine and even like realize what the potential of all the supports and our friends and families that do allow us to be vulnerable, how we can truly like bring their potential into our own lives and also bring our potential into their lives by breaking down these barriers of how we had earlier imagined Sangats to be and how we can reimagine them today.
Definitely. I think that was a beautiful way of starting off this reimagining of Sangat. Thank you for sharing that, Saki, with us. Shuranjeet, would you like to elaborate a little on what your idea or definition or understanding of Sangat is?
So I think for me, my understanding of Sangat has come in several different phases. So I was born and raised in Birmingham in the UK, and I grew up with the majority of my life being very, very tied down to place, being very, very wedded to the idea of my community, my Sangat, being located in a very particular place at a very particular time. But as I grew up, one of the things I wanted to do was go out and learn about different things, learn in different kinds of settings. And so when I went out of Birmingham, I was the first one in my immediate family to leave Birmingham and live outside since my grandparents moved to the UK in the 1960s. And so that really challenged my notion of place-based Sangat. It challenged my notion of finding the people I want to surround myself with in one particular place. And it really threw me out of my comfort zone quite starkly at that time. And I remember I had a lot of difficulties with that. I had a lot of difficulties moving out of that type of space, engaging with people who weren't my immediate Sangat, engaging with people who didn't really know me as a person, didn't really understand my upbringing, didn't understand Sikhi. And for me, that started the long and ongoing journey of developing Sangat that goes beyond place, developing Sangat in the places that you might not necessarily expect to develop Sangat. And for me, it was intimately paired with this whole understanding of myself that I was developing and constantly questioning and constantly refining, and still am, definitely. And so I remember when I was living outside of Birmingham, I would go back to Birmingham and I would feel out of place with the Sangat I had been so close to throughout my upbringing. And that made me feel scared. It made me feel confused because everything seemed to be growing, but I just seemed to be left behind in a sense. And so that, again, that really pushed me out of my comfort zone to try and engage with people in different ways to build a Sangat that goes beyond just place. And I've been lucky enough to live in a few different cities over the last few years. And one of the things that has really, really stood out to me has been the fact that Sangat is something that is not fixed. Sangat isn't something that will always want you to act a certain way. Sangat is something that will grow with you. It's something that isn't necessarily all in one piece. Sometimes it's in different pieces, in different parts of the world. Sometimes part of your Sangat will never have spoken to other parts of your Sangat, but the common essence is you. And for me, you know, the people or individuals or other whoever or whatever is in your Sangat reflects a part of you that you might not even know about. So for me, everyone that I consider in my Sangat, and there are people I engage with now who I might not necessarily consider as being in my Sangat, but when I have that type of relationship with them where I learn from them in such a way, where we have conversations where we challenge each other and we can actually help each other to build ourselves taller, that for me is this kind of really amazing thing where, you know, your Sangat is constantly growing, it's constantly changing, and it's making you reflect on parts of yourself and reflect on yourself in ways that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And so for me, it's constantly surprising. Sangat is surprising. Sangat is not always going to be comfortable. It's not always going to be an easy ride, but it's, you know, an ongoing process. It's something that speaks deeply to us in ways that we can't necessarily vocalize. It tells us things that we won't realize until 20 years after we're told them. And it will tie you to something and kind of help you to move forward in ways that we don't really know. And so, you know, I'm in a position now where we have been fortunate enough to kind of find pockets of Sangat in different places and recognize that there are, you know, I think about me as a person and sometimes we think, oh, I've done this achievement or I've done something really cool here. But in reality, it's made me understand how all of the things I do are rooted in the experiences, the knowledge, and the love of so many people. And, you know, I'm truly not what I am today or who I am today without these people. And it serves as a reminder for that for me constantly.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, yeah, I definitely relate to your idea of building Sangat beyond physical spaces. I think as I come back to my hometown and I drive through it, I'm like, I don't recognize it as much, but I think it's still, yeah, moving beyond that place and still understanding that it's still your community, even though you're not physically there all the time. Jasleen, some thoughts on what Sangat means to you, your understanding of Sangat?
Sure. I think for me, growing up, kind of removed from an immediate, like, I guess, Sangat in my immediate space, and growing up in a house that didn't feel very like Punjabi in the context that I was in, I grew up being like, I don't need that. And I think I probably held on to that feeling until I was like well into my college years. And I think, you know, I think a lot of times we think of Sangat as like people outside of your family. I think like my immediate family maybe functioned as my Sangat pretty deeply in those years, because I think a lot of like pain and sort of alienation was tied to like my childhood experience with trying to like fit into the Sangat that I was sort of presented with. And so I think that's where like my grandparents especially really just like carried the whole team on their shoulders. And so I think it wasn't until I was like in college and studying religion, and not studying Sikhi, but sort of doing like adjacent. I was like studying Islam and studying Hinduism and studying like South Asian religions. And I think that's when I started to feel like this was something I wanted to explore a lot more. And I think sometimes when our ideas of Sangat are like tied to like checklists of what it means to be Punjabi or what it means to be Sikh, or what it means to be qualified to be in certain spaces, like the only thing that comes from that is pain. And I think a lot of times we think we're the only people waiting to be like invited into a room, when in reality it's like a lot of us a lot of the time of varying backgrounds. And so Sangat for me sort of shifted from like family to like friends who weren't Sikh but who wanted to have those kinds of conversations with me, to my first Sikh friend who I made when I was like 22. And that was the moment that I was like, oh, having a conversation with somebody who is like of a similar background, who understands where I'm coming from, is something that I didn't know was what I needed, you know? And so I think over the past 3 or 4 years, that's been like what Sangat is to me. And it hasn't been in one place because my friends are spread out. And so these like kind of Sikh friends who I've been like collecting, that I talk to every so often about whether it's Sikh related things or not, just about life in general. I think that Sangat has been really important, not just in my like personal life, but also in my like work life, like feeling, because I work for Sikri and I'm doing things in Sikh spaces. If I had not met my friends that I'm friends with now at the time that I did, I don't think I would have applied to the job because I didn't feel qualified. I don't think that I would have been able to do a lot of the things that I've felt at least like semi-confident enough to do, like standing in front of certain audiences, because I don't have experience with that many Sikhs in one place, you know? And so I think Sangat for me has been, I know Shuranjeet said this earlier, like post-space Sangat. And I think that that's always been what it is for me, I guess, beyond my family members. And I think Sangat is about this like opening up, that's happening all the time, even when you don't know it. And so like, I know like Gurduara Singh talks about like people who have like tapped into like what it means to be part of oneness feel like all of the things, like they feel all the pain, they feel all the things that are happening in the world, but they figure out how to kind of take all those things in and like mix them up inside of them and put out something that isn't just like feelings and sadness and things. And I think Sangat is about opening you up to those feelings, and also about reminding you that you're part of that like vast thing, that I think, you know, sometimes it's hard to remember that we're part of the vastness. And I think like sometimes that means having really like Sikhi centered conversations, but also sometimes that just means like checking in on each other and like having conversations about like whatever you're watching on Netflix. Like I think that all those things come together to like open you up, build you up, and challenge you like all the time, just kind of in this like, I guess, everlasting sort of motion. So yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you. Yes, I think, we're all kind of tapping into these different, disparate, but also together understandings of Sangat. But maybe let's move the conversation into a perhaps more Sikhi-centered understanding of Sangat. What role has Sikhi played, or your exploration or your journey through Sikhi played in your understanding of Sangat? How do you nurture, or what nurtures your spirituality in this journey of like finding your Sangat? Shuranjeet, perhaps we could start with you.
So I guess for me, one of the main things that has helped me on my kind of Sikhi-related journey through my Sangat, one of the main things is based in seeing some hypocrisies with people I surround myself with and people who I've grown up with. And this isn't everyone I've grown up with, but this is something I've observed. And these hypocrisies or these inconsistencies were really, really stark to me when I was growing up. I saw people professing that they held particular values close. I saw people talking about topics and talking about care for one another in a Sikhi context, but did not see that reflected in their actions, did not see that reflected outside of a Gurduara space. And that left me really, really confused. It left me really confused around, is Sikhi just something that we talk about an action within a Gurduara space sometimes on a Sunday, and then we leave and everything suddenly stops? And that got me questioning, why have we got these inconsistencies? Why do we have spaces where we can behave in completely different ways to how we behave in a Gurdwara space? And how are we understanding that? And so I guess for me, as I've engaged with Sangat in different ways, it's really, really pushed me to question myself and how I might actually have these consistencies sometimes, and we all have these inconsistencies. But it's bringing a space where I can talk about these inconsistencies and learn about them and challenge them, and ultimately aim to eradicate these inconsistencies and live a life that is both based in values that might seem abstract, but they are really grounded in action and thoughtful action. And so I guess for me, questioning those discussions, questioning those ways we speak and comparing them to how we act has been a really important part of my experiences with Sangat. And when I remember when I learned about the concept of miripiri and this kind of merging and this consistency, this essential consistency between the spiritual and the temporal spaces, that really hit home to me because it just made me realize this isn't just something we do at the weekends. This isn't just something we do in a Gurudwara space. This is something that is instrumental to how we act, how we breathe, how we do everything in our lives. A framework from which to contrast, a framework with through which to think, and just something that is so much more than 3 or 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon. And so these realizations have only been possible through engaging with Sangat in a different kind of way and having these structures of accountability where we can talk to each other and we can say, how do you talk about this and then how do you act like this in ways that are compassionate and ways that aren't confronting and in ways that we're looking for the mutual uplift of each other. And it's an ongoing process, as Jasleen said, an continuously moving thing, growing thing. It's like an organism, I don't know. And I guess it's that constant kind of it's that continuity. And for me, that is properly foundationally based in Sikhi.
Thank you, Shuranjeet. Yeah, I think this this separation between rhetoric and action is definitely something I've also struggled through, and I think lots of people could relate to that. Jasleen, perhaps you could speak on how your spirituality has been nurtured, or what has nurtured your spirituality or Sikhi in your journey towards finding your Sangat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, I feel like I've told this story a lot, so I'll just tell it again. The summer that I spent at Civic, the summer before I started working for Sikri, truly changed my life. And I think that was because I had all this baggage and these feelings of imposter syndrome and feeling not legitimate, not like I could occupy the space that I wanted to occupy, or even study the things I wanted to study. And I think for that reason, my Sikhi journey didn't really start because I didn't feel like I had permission, which I now know I didn't need permission, but I think I didn't feel even like I was in the right place to begin. And so I came to Civic, and that summer was particularly unique, I think, because, and this I think maybe is a case of kind of a transitory Sangat that kind of is there and then it disperses and you latch on to certain people. But in that space, in that place, I think there were a lot of people of really, really different backgrounds. A lot of people who had never read the Guru Granth Sahib, never set foot in a Gurduara. A lot of people like me who just hadn't set foot in a Gurduara in years because it was truly anxiety inducing. And just a lot of people who didn't feel qualified. And that was the first time I had been in a space with 30 to 40 other Sikhs around my age who were struggling through the same things and talking about them, and also crying a lot. A lot of crying that summer. But I think that summer was the moment that I understood that I wasn't the only person kind of waiting outside in the metaphorical corridor for somebody to invite me in. Everybody was out there and I don't even know who's in the room. And so that having that sort of temporary sort of time kind of Sangat in that space made me, I think, really feel it's not just that I don't need to be asking for space in a particular community, but I think it's our responsibility, especially if we can empathize with that feeling of being on the periphery, to make space for other people too, or to even just vocalize those feelings, because I think a lot of times it goes back to the checklist thing. It's a lot of times we're well, they know this spot and they do this and they do their nitnem every day and they wake up really early. and I think we sort of put ourselves in these categories, and maybe that's a human thing. I think it is. And so we feel we need somebody who has certain things checked off to be oh no, come on in. And maybe sometimes we do, but once we're there and once we realize that a lot of people don't know a lot of the time and are uncertain a lot of the time, I think it's important to take that vulnerability and open ourselves up to talking about that with other people, because once we do, that's when other people who are I didn't even think that I could have a Sikhi journey are oh wait, I actually can, and this is something that I'm interested in. And so that summer for me was I think the beginning. And what Shuranjeet said earlier of without certain people, without certain members of your Sangat, you really look back even a year ago. I would not be able to do a lot of the things that I've done if I didn't have the support system that I had. That's mostly over text. You know what I mean? I just wouldn't have it. And I think that the role that Sangat plays in your Sikhi journey is sometimes it's as simple as I'm struggling with this thing, or oh, the hukam today was this, and it's beautiful, and let's talk about it. And sometimes it's you know, Shuranjeet was talking about hypocrisy. I think a lot of the work that I do with like State of the Month report, we did a report on abortion and we did a report on sexuality that's coming out soon. And so there are like certain things that even in writing that report, which is like very personal always, because these are like community issues and also personal things, having conversations like on the phone with my friends, sick and non-sick, about the things that I'm writing about and processing, that's part of my Sikhi journey too. Like, how am I coming to certain conclusions about the issues that I'm writing on? And how am I also processing the fact that like a lot of people disagree with me and are like upset about what we've put out as an organization. And also in the case of like the abortion report, right? Like very personal. I'm a person with a uterus. And I remember really struggling with like what I wanted the report to say versus like what the report needed to say, because maybe we think that we're like woke and like righteous all the time. And I think that that's like a common thing, but sometimes the nuance is lost there. And Sangat challenges you to sort of pull back too and understand that like, all right, people are going to disagree with you and you need to figure out where the nuance is and how to sit in that like discomfort. So yeah, I think my Sikhi journey has only existed because of Sangat, and only continues to like grow in a way where I'm confident enough to even speak about certain things because of the like support and opening up that Sangat has given me.
Thank you, Jasleen. Yeah, I think this like perpetual learning is so important. And yes, this nuance that you speak of, I think that's like where the growth happens when someone questions you. And honestly, I have the privilege of sitting in on Jasleen's online course that she's teaching to teens about Sikhi, and I learn new things about Sikhi every single time I tune in. And it's, yeah, something I'm so, so grateful for. And my understanding and worldview shifts every single time. Vineet, perhaps a little bit about what role Sikhi has played in your journey to finding Sangat?
Yeah, I think so. Sikhi, before I even started to like engage with Sikhi and myself and started seeing them as like a unit together rather than something that was part of my culture, Sikhi had provided me with an ideal of what a Sangat should be. And I always expected my Sangats, therefore, to match up to that ideal. And they didn't, because nothing is ever ideal. Ideals they're tools for inspiration. Oftentimes, life cannot be ideal. And so I think that's what I struggled with a lot before I started kind of thinking about like Sikhi and myself. Like I think just for myself, when I started thinking about what my friends and I like need to do for me to be on my own journey with Sikhi, that's when I started to realize that the Sangat that is presented in Bani is an ideal that I need to inspire towards, but does not need to exist right now and right here. It's steps that we're going to take to like be better within ourselves, and that this work of betterment as a collective manifests in a political space, but this work of betterment of our own individuals exists in like a more spiritual space. And so my Sangat is constantly therefore helping me reach my own ideal of Sangat and also like the collective ideal of Sangat. But that realization, like it's sort of a paradox, because even though like Bani presented me with an ideal for Sangat, I was not able to distinguish the symbolism of that ideal as a tool for inspiration versus like, what I was constantly seeking until I started to engage more deeply myself and like actively with Sikhi. And so in a way, that engagement with Sikhi is not only given me Sangat and an ideal for Sangat, but also propelled me to break down this like constant seek for perfection in my Sangat, and therefore to actually engage with my Sangat in a true meaningful way and not pretend that Sangat needs to exist in a particular space, in a particular form, and in a particular perfection. And then I think the first time ever in my life where my Sikh Sangat helped me exercise my vulnerability was similar to Jasleen at Siddiq. And when I reflect more on that experience, it's because so many of us also show up to that place with this vulnerability already very consciously present in our minds that we don't know much. And I feel like in my everyday life, I exercise that concept very consciously. I feel like, oh, I know how to do certain things in my day. But when you show up in a particular space where everybody is on some vulnerable level talking to each other and sharing this experience of like this fear of unknown, like what happens if I expose myself to this notion that I actually don't know much about who I am, is where I first time felt this vulnerability within even like a Sikh space. And that was so beautiful because I was able to like see some of those ideals that I often read in Bani shine through, and like become more personal to me. So this journey with Sangat has always been underlined with Sikh concepts, but for a lot of my life, I wasn't able to distinguish this notion of perfection and reality, and how Sangat, the ideal of Sangat, can be inspirational, but not doesn't have to be that right here, right now.
Lovely. Amazing. Thank you, Vineet. I think, yeah, similar to what Jasleen was saying, letting go of this idea that we know anything. And yeah, understanding that, hey, I don't know much. But yes, I've definitely felt this, like, I don't belong in this space. This is for this person on this checklist, and that's not me. Something I'm interested in knowing about all of you, because I think in my relationship with all of you, this is something I've picked up. But there's this journey, this leaving and this coming back. So what has propelled you to come back? Because we feel so disconnected from these Sangats, like we don't belong here, but we still have this, we want to come back to our Sangats. We want to find our Sangat. Yes, where does this come from? And not even just to come back, but to build it better. Because I know with all of the work you guys do, it's to propel our Sangats, to propel our communities to be better. So not only are we pushed out, but we want to come back in and help lift our communities. So is there something that you could point to, a concept, a moment, anything? I'd love to know. What made you come back and propel your communities engage with your communities in such intimate ways? Because yes, I think all of us kind of pointed to moments where we felt like we didn't belong and we wanted to leave, but then we come back and we come back so much more intimately than I think other people do. I hope that all made sense. Jasleen, perhaps we could start with you.
I think about this a lot. I think like every day I'm like, oh man, don't go on Sikh Twitter. I feel like that's really the flaw on my part. But I think it's funny. I think like the idea of like community at large, or like the Bunt, I think in a way my smaller Sangats have given me the like confidence and sort of emotional bandwidth to deal with whatever will come when I'm occupying certain spaces or involving myself in certain work. And I think when you really love something, it's kind of like with a sibling, I guess, maybe just like a much larger sibling, a collective sibling, where it's like, oh, what you did there was like hypocritical, or maybe I didn't agree with that, or I don't believe that that aligns with like Sikhi values or whatever it might be. But I like love you anyway, and because of that, I will stay here, and we can try to talk it out. Or maybe I'll write something, and maybe you'll read, and maybe you won't. But I think that like, yeah, I think it's interesting that like for a lot of the people, especially that I encounter in the work that we do in like I feel like a lot of the people who are involved in this kind of work have that same story where it's like, well, I didn't see this particular thing being addressed, and maybe that's what it is. I didn't see this particular thing being addressed, and because it wasn't being addressed, like I experienced pain or whatever it might be. And so I want to give somebody who's coming after me that space. And we talk about this at Sikri all the time. It's like, is our work sort of inherently like this selfish thing because we are all growing from it? And I think about that with the teen course a lot too, because I was not sitting in a classroom with like anybody my age from the similar backgrounds to like talk about Sikhi related things. Like Sikhi was for Sundays and that was it. And in a lot of ways, I feel like when I'm teaching, facilitating that class, every time it's different. And you said you learn things every time. I learn things every time. And I think like that personal sort of understanding of the importance of those spaces or the importance of having those tools really comes from not having, like experiencing not having them. And so I think like a lot of it is about seeing needs not being addressed or seeing spaces not being created for certain people or for certain conversations, and sort of making a mental note and being like, okay, well, how can I take part in opening those things up? And yeah, and I think that goes back to like what I think, but probably both Vineet and I experienced at Civic, which was like, oh, we all feel this way. Now, how do we pull in more people who feel this way and make them understand that they're not the only person who's going through that? And I think like that's what really keeps you coming back, is like love for your community, even when like you don't always feel it, and just like the sort of stubborn insistence that you're going to expect better of the people that you love, for the just like general betterment of the bunth, and just like so people don't have to go through the same thing that you might have gone through.
Definitely, yes. I definitely agree that this is, a similar narrative that lots of us fall into. Shuranjeet?
So I guess for me, I feel a very, very deep sense of duty to all of the people who have contributed towards who I am today. And for me, that fundamentally starts with my parents. And it's, even just sitting here reflecting now, it's actually so interesting, because I thought I could separate, my kind of personal family life with my work that I do with Taraqi around Punjabi mental health, but they're so fundamentally connected. For me, my parents, and in particular someone like my dad, has really shown us how we can act in a way that is both conscientious of each other, we're allowed to be vulnerable, but fundamentally we want to work for the upliftment of others. And so when I started the kind of mental health related work, the first thing that came to my mind was my dad, because my dad has been very open with me about his struggles with his mental health issues. And that just showed me how much I owe to my family, to my parents. And I know, not everyone has necessarily had that kind of relationship with their parents. Not everyone can say that they've come from a household that has formed that type of environment. But for me, it gave me such a huge push, such a huge boost, and continues to give me such a big boost, that I'm just looking to redistribute within the different areas I find myself in. And just a kind of small thing around vulnerability, because I know vulnerability was brought up in the previous question. One of the things that I've been, so privileged to be a part of is one of the initiatives we have is an open group for Punjabi men. And this is a group of individuals who don't necessarily know each other, but these are a group of individuals who will talk about a topic, will open themselves up to each other, and will accept other people who are opening themselves up to each other in a way that I've never seen before. At one of our previous forums, one of the guys had written a poem, and he read the poem out to a group of other guys he's never met before. And there was another session where one of the people said something that was quite upsetting for them, and they got quite emotional. And I remember one of the other guys got up, didn't know this guy previously an hour before, got up, sat next to the guy, gave him a tissue, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm so proud of you for talking about that." And for me, these people might not consider themselves as a part of a Sangat, but they were displaying the values and they were acting on the values that for me were just so integral. And so I get reminded of that every day. With the work I do, I get reminded of how much we have not only to offer ourselves, but to offer the rest of the world. And that drives for me this sense of duty that I don't know why I wake up with every day, but I just kind of like get up, carry on, keep my head down, get on with things. And it's just, it's just cool. And it's very hard to explain, but I am ultimately so grateful for mum and dad for shaping a space where me and my other siblings can be what we want to be and be the best of what we want to be, for not just ourselves, but for our Sangat as well. And yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story with us, Shuranjeet. I think, yes, this redistributing and sharing is definitely, I think so well put. Vineet?
I just realized I wasn't on mute this entire time.
It's okay.
I think it's really remarkable that both Jasleen and Shuranjeet have gone back to the spaces that initially projected alienation at them. For me, I feel like most of my engagement in community building does happen in spaces that are trying to be built with the foundation that everybody's going to leave their previous notions behind, and we're going to build something new and now. And I think but at the end of I agree with everything Jasleen and Shuranjeet said, and I do hope that I'm also in a position one day where the communities that did make me feel like they were full and they didn't need me to be part of it, and I didn't have anything to give them, that I could embody that principle where I could, I can say that I do have fragrance to give, and I can take up space. I can take up space without taking up space. I can be present, and there's a lot of value in that work, because when you do enter communities that might have that exclusion principle and built into them, you're allowing others who may not be, you're allowing members of that community who are not actively trying to exclude others, but are doing that like inadvertently because of some learned mechanisms. You're retraining them to see those aspects about their community framework. So in order to like come back into the communities, I think it's so much of it is also built into like, you know, the sense that we must give back to the communities that have taught us a lot about who we are. And then we felt that there's some work that needs to be done, the work that has to do with belongingness and making everyone else feel belonged to in that space. But I think I just want to say that if you don't feel like doing that work, that's totally fine. Like go go ahead and gather in spaces where you do feel safe right now, because you do need to first feel that you are fragrant and you're so light that you can enter spaces that are pushing you and saying that they don't need you, and that you can like enter and say, I don't need you to validate that I need to be here. I'm here because I know I have something to give. So um, both of these processes happen, and I'm constantly like, not constantly, sometimes I'm like unconsciously I'm trying to see like, do I need a space right now where everyone else is giving me a sense of belongingness, so I can um, be vulnerable about all the fears that I have about unbelongingness. And then at other times I feel like, you know, I can charge in and say that the feeling of belongingness is not what I need right now. It's like the feeling of change and action. And so I think in that sense, like Miri and Piri can exist at the same time. They can exist in like in a I'm like losing a word, but you may need to tap into your spirituality and then your political action. Sometimes you're in a political space where you need to then tap into your spirituality. So um, if somebody is feeling like, you know, the gathering around them is not as safe and as giving, then maybe also reconsider like seeking out other gatherings that could be doing that, so that they can charge themselves up in that way.
Thank you so much, Vineet. Yes, that was such an important point. Thank you so very much for putting that in there. Yeah, I definitely agree. I definitely did paint it more as a positive XYZ as opposed to, yeah, grappling with that struggle. I would invite everyone who is tuning in right now to ask any questions that they might have. I will be opening it up to questions. We do have one from Jasleen Singh in Sacramento. They ask, do any of the panel members include non-Sikhs in their Sangat, include Americans in fellowship and groups doing seva? Perhaps Jasleen, we can start with you.
Okay. Yes. I think growing up in a pretty white town, I didn't really venture into having those conversations until I got to college, which was also a pretty white school. And so I have asked this question a lot to people who know more than me, which is like, can people who are not Sikh be your Sangat? And the answer is yes. And I think there is something valuable in the conversations that you have with people who don't have the same background as you, which maybe is not like it's not a revelatory thing to say that, I don't think, but in a way, like we've talked a lot about like cultural baggage, the baggage of like being part of certain communities, and to talk to people who don't have that and have them push conversations in a certain way I think has helped me a lot in growing. So one of my best friends from college is a Pentecostal religious studies scholar whose name is Peter. And I know that like every time that we would talk, it was like this. I don't know. I don't usually think of it as interfaith dialogue, because I don't think that's what it was. I think it's two friends talking about things that they're thinking about. But we've talked about like death. We've talked about the divine, about Jesus, obviously. But those conversations push me to think about what I believe, where I think I fit in, because I think he is good at like pushing me to be more confident in those spaces. And it's just a different perspective. And I think that like my family members who are not Sikhs, so like my Uncle Max, my Uncle Jeff, my Uncle Chris, they bring a different perspective too. And they're actually the people, funnily enough, in my family, besides like my immediate family, like my parents and my siblings, who actually ask me the most about the work that I'm doing, and who really like are interested in it and like really want to have very long conversations about like the things that I'm working on. And I think that is a really valuable thing. I just think if we limit Sangat to just people in our like immediate sort of faith communities, we're missing certain perspectives. And I'll give one more example. So like in the religious studies department at UVA, there's no like Sikh studies. And I studied a lot of like South Asian Islam, so a lot of Sufism. And the conversations I had with Muslim grad students who were oftentimes like international students from Pakistan, about certain like philosophical concepts very much inform the way that I understand my own like Sikhi journey. So an example that I give a lot in the teens session on connecting with Jasleen Kaur is about Ibn Arabi's concept of the light going through a prism. And he says that when a white light passes through a prism, it is this infinite rainbow spectrum of light. And so in the same way, there is unicity and multiplicity, right, in creation. And so the way that I kind of think about who I'm surrounding myself with in my Sangat is like, how am I connecting to the vastness through my relationships? Because Ibn Arabi talks about, like, if you look at a flower and you say, that's a beautiful flower, you're connecting with the divine attribute of beauty, right? And when I think about what it means to be compassionate or empathetic or forgiving, the hard one, I get that example from the relationships I have with people who I think embody those qualities in a way that I don't, and who push me to become more like that. And so I don't think that I don't think that Sangat is just about being around a bunch of Sikhs. I think it's being around people who push you in those ways, and who support you in those ways.
Beautiful, thank you. We have another question, and if Vineet is comfortable, I might throw this one at Vineet, and then we can all also hop in. Yes, Harban Salal, will anyone describe what Guru had in mind when he established Sangats? What were his instructions as to what is the role of Sangat? And I know I only pick on Vineet because she was beautifully already toying with this fact beforehand, she's toying with this idea beforehand, and I'd love for her to share it with everyone, if she's comfortable.
Yes, I mean, I'm comfortable to relate it to my experience, and so obviously I encourage everyone to connect with Gurbani to see what gurus are imagining when they say about Sangat, because it can be very personally interpreted by everyone. But I will speak to some of the translations that I looked at before this webinar, for those who may not feel very comfortable engaging directly with Gurbani. And so when I was looking at how Guru Sahibs are imagining Sangat through Gurbani, some of the ways they're imagining Sangats playing a role in life of Sangats is Sangats help my virtues shine forth. So they are creating an environment where you are able to recognize what are your virtues, and maybe what are not your virtues, and they're challenging and pushing you to allow to hone your virtues, um, and move forward with them as part of your baggage and not your non-virtues. Another way they imagined it was, without Sangat, there's no hope for life. And that it's almost you feel cursed because you keep hitting these barriers. But Sangat is the one that is, pushing these barriers for you. So you realize that these barriers in your life are not these tall walls that cannot be surmounted, that there is hope, and that your Sangat is with you pushing on these walls. And it's like a collective effort of building hope, and that Sangats help obtain the essence of love. And that essence of love, again, everybody will have their own definitions of love. But for me, how I interpreted this essence of love is when you don't, like, doing this work of realizing that you're not the one loving or being loved, and that like there's this vastness that is emerging through you, so that vastness doesn't need to be loved, and it doesn't need to love because it just is. And this Sangat around you is helping you tap into that essence when you're around them. So these are some of the ways that I interpreted how our Guru Sahibs imagined Sangats in Gurbani. But then again, I'll say that this is how my interpretations are, and these are like this is how I felt how Sangats were being imagined. And I definitely invite those who are interested to explore more to do their own work into it.
Thank you, Vineet. Perhaps Shuranjeet, you'd like to hop in here, say some stuff?
So from my perspective, again, I don't really think I am confident enough to speak to the particular kind of facets of Sangat expressed in Gurbani, and I wouldn't want to kind of say I am and then not do it justice for myself. I guess for me, as Vineet mentioned, this real kind of appreciation of the collective nature of our being. We often look at this, dichotomy people say between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophies, between individualization and collectivization, and collective attitudes to kind of understanding life. And I feel my relationship to that, how I'm understanding that, changes all the time, especially when I'm thinking about Sangat. So as I was speaking earlier, just realizing how all of the things that might come out of me as a person are themselves rooted in so many others. And we think we might be, acting out of our own volition, but there is so much that has gone into that, so much unacknowledged work, so much unappreciated work. The small things that we often take for granted, and these are just things that, for me, speak to how interconnected all of our interactions are, all of our lives are. So I guess maybe one day in the future, I will be able to better vocalize how Sangat and my experiences of Sangat might be related to how the Guru Sahibs imagine Sangat as well in Gurbani. But I do think we're at an exciting time where, as you know, the title of the discussion, reimagining Sangat and what that might look like, we're at an exciting time where we have a lot more possibilities, and we have opportunities to be in spaces where we do feel safe. And I think Vineet made that point really, really importantly. We don't want to put everyone in the same box and say everyone has to be duty bound to a particular section of their life. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that that will come in different forms for different people at different points in their lives. And yeah, maybe one day I'll be better at articulating this.
You are already great at articulating it. I think, yeah, what we're doing here is we're like kind of like, oh, we're still not qualified enough. Like, I think we're kind of still asking permission, as we were like previously talking about. But I think, yeah, it's also wonderful to acknowledge that we don't have a full, complete answer for what the Guru said Sangat is, and there isn't one. So perhaps there isn't one. But yes, I appreciated these answers very much. Jasleen, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add, there's two bodies in Asakivar that what Vineet was saying made me think of. And so one is about the vastness. That's 43. And Guru Nanak Sahib basically says that like all these things that are happening, all the things that we might think are like bad or horrible, like decay and death and destruction, as much as like the very good things that happen or the things that are awe-inspiring in kind of the ways that we think a thing should be awe-inspiring, like all of those things are part of the vastness. And the sort of ideal is to get to a place where you're so tapped into that vastness that like even the sort of like things that are bad inspire the same awe in you as the things that are good. And I think that is something that maybe we can take to the discussion about Sangat, especially when we're talking about hypocrisy, or the things that we wish could be made better, and maybe that we're actively trying to be made to make better within our communities, big and small. And so I think Sangat is about opening us up to that vastness. And I think maybe the people that we don't even realize are opening us up to that because they're not part of like what we would say our Sangat is, our immediate Sangat is, like the people that challenge us in ways where we're like, I can't believe that person said that thing on the internet for all to see. We like that's still opening us up to something, I think. And so I think that's a big part is vastness. And then another 40 that I was thinking of is 4014. And Guru Nanak Sahib is talking about like these trees. They're silk cotton trees in English. And he says that they're these like tall, thick, beautiful trees. And the problem is that when a bird goes to the tree, they will find that the flowers are scentless and the fruit is tasteless, and there's like nothing of worth that the bird can take from that tree. And he's relating that to sort of people in positions of power, whether that's like people with a lot of money or people with a lot of political power, like whatever we sort of conceive of as like a powerful person because of sort of checklist things. And he says that the people that you really want to seek out are the people who speak sweetly and have sweet humility. And he doesn't just say humility, he says sweet humility. Don't ask me what that is, don't know yet. We'll work on that. But yeah, I think there are sort of like hints as to like who we need to be surrounding ourselves with, and who maybe we shouldn't be fooled by. Maybe that's kind of a crass way of saying it, but who to kind of read them for who they are fully and kind of understand the big picture. And that's not to say that we're like looking at people who maybe are in those positions of power and are a lot of talk and not a lot of action and saying like, I'm better than you, and like I don't need to, like you have to. I think it's about understanding that we're all part of that same vastness, and like understanding that like maybe I'm steering away from that person, but my work is just as much about that person as it is about the people who have sweet humility, right? So, yeah, I guess there are hints maybe in Gurbani about who we should be sort of surrounding ourselves with. But
Thank you, Jasleen. I think this speaks to, yes, Vineet, I will let you jump in, but I think, this speaks to this always learning that happens when I get to sit in on these conversations. So thank you. That really helped me in shaping and understanding my world a little bit better. Vineet, a thought?
I think to just go back to that question, I had another, thought, and that is that our understanding of Sangat is going to constantly evolve. How I imagined Sangat today was not how I imagined Sangat when I was 5 or when I was 7, 8, 12, 20, 22. It changed at all of those moments in my life. And I hope that it continues to change. And that's one aspect that we need to, that's from my personal experience. And if that is true to me, then I'm also compelled to think that how gurus imagine Sangat within Gurbani is also going to change as you dive deeper into Gurbani and you engage with Gurbani in like a totality versus like trying to understand something. And so I have a personal experience with this concept because when I was younger and like especially in earlier university, when I was trying to engage with Sikhi, I started doing reras every evening, and I always ended reras with how like you're in this life to meet and to like realize the divinity, but your Sat Sangat often came up in the sense that Mil Sat Sangat Paj Keval Naam, and that became an ideal in my life at that point when I was struggling the most with Sangat, because I thought that Sangat was Sad Sangat in this case was where I sit down and I do Simran, and I only do Simran, because that line in Gurbani just had such an impact on me because I like thought and reflected on it every day. But at that moment in my life when I like was seeking Sangat the most, it sort of became a barrier, not because there's flaw in that line, but because there was an incomplete understanding I had of Gurbani at that point in my life. And so I understood it and thought, okay, Sangat is place where I sit down and I only meditate on Naam. Everybody else that I'm not doing that with is not my Sangat. And that was such a like block that prevented me from tapping into the potential of my Sangat. So I think I would just encourage us to like continually engage with how these metaphors grow in our life, how we engage with Gurbani and Sangat, and how that evolves, and be okay with this vulnerability that what it is now will not be what it is now is not fixed and complete, and it's going to evolve. And that kind of goes back to that vulnerability Jasleen was talking about. Because if we sit in that vulnerability, that whatever we're experiencing and the way we're experiencing Sangat now is going to change, that allows our Sangat to be open, to have others participate in it and feel belonged to, because everybody else is also feeling that their understanding of Sangat is not complete.
Thank you for that, Vineet. We do have another question from Shubdeep from Winnipeg. I'm going to throw this one at Shuranjeet because I think it makes sense. They ask, what are your thoughts on the Sikh Sangat from a political lens? E.g., the more Sikhs in different political parties, the better to have our perspective heard.
So I think for me, it's very difficult, especially in our society now, to have a conversation about politics that doesn't talk about ego. For me, politics and political landscapes are one of the areas where people can become very, very easily intoxicated on ego. And so when it comes to Sangat, keeping a Sangat and having trust in a Sangat that might span across a political spectrum or in different parties becomes very difficult. And so if we're thinking about Sangat, then, I mentioned earlier the notion of compassion that is so integral to Sangat. For me, that compassion doesn't mean that we're going to be pushed over and we're going to be stepped on. That for me, that compassion is lined with critique, and it's lined with a move towards collective justice within Sikh and also non-Sikh communities. And so just because you might be a Sikh who holds different kinds of political views, that doesn't mean my compassion isn't going to hold you to account on your views. And it isn't going to question the logics upon which your decisions are made. And so for me, when we look at politics, when we look at political parties, as has been mentioned in the question, we're looking at things that are tools. Political parties are tools, fundamentally. They're tools for people to try and make decisions and try and shape how society works. But very easily they can become more than a tool. We can see them as a personality trait, and we can get lost in the illusion of the parties themselves, in the illusions of what we think they represent. And then we lose focus on the issues that we were looking at. We might lose focus on the communities we were trying to work alongside, whether they're Sikh, whether they're non-Sikh. But we might very easily lose focus of what has brought us into this space in the first place. And so for me, when we're looking at, Sikhs across different political spectrums, again, when we import Western political spectrums onto Sikh action, that can become very, very problematic very easily. And so that's what I like to focus on, action. And I like to focus on looking at how the values they hold close, how that is reflected or not reflected in the actions they're putting forward. And again, this doesn't mean pushing other people away completely so that you can't have dialogue with them, but it's trying to have that dialogue and not being pushed over in that dialogue, and not letting people beat you with the stick of compassion. People say you need to be compassionate to be in this instance. In reality, our compassion is there, but our compassion manifests through our critique. And that critique isn't just based in what we might feel, but it's based in our experiences of how other communities might be subjugated or other communities might be oppressed, because we haven't got an eye to everything. Sikh experiences of oppression aren't the only experiences of oppression in the world. And sometimes we need to open people up to that and ensure that they are acknowledging that in their actions. But yeah, it's a difficult one. And I do think Sangat, it is a political concept. Like, it can't not be a political concept. But yeah.
Thank you. I think that was, it's beautifully said. I think, yes, that was helpful in understanding, the multiple roles that Sangat can play. So conversation that we were all kind of having before this webinar was, and kind of throughout, and Vineet beautifully illuminated for us, how do we make our Sangats, our personal Sangats, our wider, more mainstream understanding of Sangats, how do we make them more welcoming, more open for all? And something that came up, and I know Jasleen mentioned Sikh Twitter, so something that's all over Sikh Twitter right now is Pride Month just ended, is this notion of, can you be Sikh and non-binary? Can you be Sikh and LGBTQ+? So how, and this is something I personally struggle with, how do you make the spaces that you create and that you engage with inclusive to multitudes of identities? But yes, how do we engage with that? And I think in our previous conversation, this concept of genderlessness came up. So when in our Sikh journeys do we become genderless? Do we ever, because of the worldview in which we are situated in? Is that possible? Yes. So yeah, just kind of grappling with all of that I've said. If anybody wants to be the first one to hop in there, Vineet or Jasleen, happy to take it to either of you.
Yeah, I can start this conversation. So I think anytime we want to label something or someone as our Sangat, we need to remember, what does it contain? What does it have to be for it to be a Sangat? And there's lots of definitions of that. But Sangat can be, whenever you're thinking about the concept Sangat, it's understood that you are looking at it from a Sikh lens. Therefore, it's imperative that there is some essence of Sikhi or Guru's vision or Bani embedded into it. And I think that's all that it requires for a Sangha to take place. Because if that is existing within you, it does not need to exist with your outward space. So you could have a Sangat with a book, because you are looking at that book from this introspective Sikh essence that exists within you. You could have Sangat with Guru Sahib. You could have Sangat with Gurbani. You could have Sangat with a river, with sky, with birds. And these are all examples that exist within Gurbani as well. So it is not necessary that it is not necessary for you to imagine that the other person in your Sangat has to be a Sikh or somebody who consciously uses, Sikh vocabulary to engage in a Sangat with you. And if that's how I imagine my Sangat, that this notion of Sangat needs to be from within me, then everyone else is invited in that space. And Jasleen even mentioned that it can be people who challenge you. It could be people who oppose you. In fact, it could be people who sometimes bring you down. That also may not matter when you are operating with the essence of wanting to be part of a Sangat with anything. And so to exclude people because they might not bring the same values that you ascribe to the table from Sangat, from Sikh Sangat, from Sikh month, then reflects, I think, more about how you define your Sangat and how you're limiting your Sangat than the person that you're excluding. That's where I will stop with my thought.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing your thought. Jasleen?
I think I know Vineet had actually said this earlier, so I'll just repeat it in case she forgot. But you said that there is this moment where, at least in the space that you are in with Sangat, where certain categories that define you kind of melt away because you're being interacted with by people who understand who you are internally and see you for your internal voice rather than limiting you to how you exist in your human body in the world, right? And that's not to say that our backgrounds as human beings, as women, as men, as non-binary folks, as as whatever range of experiences that we come with, I think those do play a part in what we bring to our Sangats. But I do feel there's this moment when, and I don't know if it's a moment or if it's like a constant sort of like cultivation of a kind of world that is outside of the one that we maybe live in day to day, when you're with your Sangat and they clearly are interacting with you in a way that is like transcending those categories, in the ways that matter. I mean, if we're talking about, like, let's say we're talking about Black Lives Matter, I'm not going to like erase, you know, my friend's blackness because I know that that brings something to that conversation, right? If we're talking about pride, I want to talk to people who that's like a personal thing for them. I want to talk to them, and surround myself with people who bring those perspectives to things that I can't speak on. So I think there is this kind of like interplay between like, I see you as like your essence or your voice without categories, but I also understand that we are people in a world with categories, and what you bring as a result of that to the table because of what you've experienced, that is valuable. And I think we live in a time where there is a lot of like vitriol that's easily accessible because of the internet, but I also have seen like so many Sikhs specifically this month coming out on Twitter in a very brave way, and saying like, I'm bisexual or I'm queer or whatever it may be, and just like the comments from other Sikhs who don't know them, who truly don't know them at all, who are like, I think that you're brave and I support you, and even though you might exist in spaces that make you feel like you are not valid because of this thing that is a category, you're valid to me. And I think that that's like we live in such a powerful time where like we can give that to people with just like a little type, you know, and press enter. and so, yeah, I think that like a way that we can actively make our Sangats more inclusive, even when other people are actively fighting against that, because they will be forever. I think it is about like reaching out to the people that have, I guess, voiced that they don't feel like they belong, and maybe talking to them and supporting them in small ways, whether it's just like a thumbs up on the internet or like a friend that you know who's like very much still feeling alienated. Because Sangat doesn't have to be in the Gurduara, and it doesn't have to be with particular people who have particular things checked off as like, I'm this level of Sikh, you know, like that's just not how it has to be. And I think that we are at a time where we're kind of collectively realizing that. And I think that's powerful. So let's see.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just going to be mindful of time. So Shuranjeet, maybe some closing statements if you'd like to pick up on that question. And we also have one from Gurpreet that you could touch on. I know we're like essentially out of time, but the question is, how does Sangat affect stress? Does this depend on type of Sangat? How does culture and ritual play into Sangat definition? And I'm very sorry to put such a vast, beautiful question to you for like 2 minutes.
No worries. So just to build really quickly on what was discussed previously about building inclusive Sangat, I think it's also important to acknowledge that different people are at different stages with how much they're ready to be involved with particular Sangat. And so we might feel as though particular, say, LGBTQ plus Sikhs, there is increased visibility, and that's absolutely amazing. But it's not just about us saying, come into our space, but it's also allowing spaces for LGBTQ plus Sikhs to develop their Sangat in a way that also makes sense to them. And just because these might be happening in separate conversations doesn't mean that they're not a part of an overall Sangat that is, again, working towards a similar goal. And, you know, this is a thing I sometimes think around, sometimes we want to kind of put everything in one space, but not everything's ready to be put in one space straight away. We need to think about how things work individually and how things can make sense of their worlds, because as Jasleen mentioned, our worlds and our experiences are different in a lot of ways. And so we need those spaces to make sense of our worlds. And then when people are ready at different points, that's when those worlds can kind of interconnect and relate in different ways that go beyond those labels. And so, yeah, I thought that's always fun. And one of the most amazing things we can do is welcome people into Sangat, but not make them feel as though they are bound to a particular Sangat. And allow people to come in and come out when they feel as though they want to, and also give them the space so that they can create their own Sangat and the people who mean important things to them. Okay, how does Sangat affect stress? I guess I'm speaking on a personal capacity here. Whenever we are experiencing things in our lives that might be difficult for us, they might bring up feelings of stress. It's a natural kind of response, right? It's a natural human response. And I guess the issue comes not only when you have moments of stress, we all have moments of stress in our lives, but it's when you have a continual stress. And if this is happening a lot of times to you within a particular Sangat, it's just worth asking a question of maybe why that's happening. And if you're able to actually discuss why that's happening with your Sangat, if that's a possibility. For me, I know with my personal experiences of Sangat, it's a place where I can speak openly about things that might be stressing me out, things that might not necessarily be going the way I would like them to go. And as everyone's mentioned today, Sangat goes beyond, place. There are so many amazing communities online. There are so many amazing communities that don't meet up face to face. And just quickly on, does this depend on the type of Sangat? I think we've covered that. And how does culture and rituals play into Sangat? For me, I really just predicate a lot of my interactions with people based on action. Just because we go to the same place, just because we enter the same two doors, just because we might speak a similar language, that doesn't really mean that we are immediately Sangat. It doesn't mean that we have a connection that is particularly special, if you get me. For me, getting to know people based on their actions and how their actions reflect their values has been the most important thing. And for me, that's something I've taken, from my understandings of Sikhi. So things that go beyond performance, things that go beyond the surface level, and things that are actually grounded in the kind of material realities of people, of communities, of the pond, really. So yes.
Thank you for answering all of the questions so concisely and beautifully, Shuranjeet. And with that, I will have to make my closing statements. I do thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this conversation, for anyone who asked questions, and apologies for all questions that were missed, and anyone who is sitting in and listening. I hope this conversation was fruitful to you in some way. I know it was fruitful to me, but I am a little biased. Yes, so please tune in for our next live webinar, Bhakti and Shakti, on July 19th, where we explore questions such as, what are the modern applications of these fluid concepts? How do we maintain a true connection to all the strength, internal and external, that Sikhi affords us? Join us in a conversation with historians and academics, Dr. Jasleen Kaur, Vineet Singh, and Jasleen Kaur, as we look at the theory and application of the concept in our modern journeys. And lastly, don't forget to tune in to the Sikhcast, a podcast produced by Sikri, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.